Thank you so much for choosing CAS TV. Welcome to the Conservation Conversation with Mitem Tai Kirui. I hope you're doing well. We appreciate you for choosing to stay with us. Today on the program, we are speaking about the effects of intensive farming on biodiversity, and especially looking at its effect on animals. And that is why I'm privileged to be sitting down with Agriculture Campaigns Manager, Dr. Victor Yamo from Wild Animals Protection, here tonight to talk to us about what effects, when you're talking about intensive farming, has on animals specifically, but of course you're going to look at plants and even as humans. Yesterday was World Animals Day,
yeah.
Right? So karibu sana kwa studio.
Asante sana.
Why do you think it's important for us to be celebrating these milestones, like World Animals Day, for example?
I think the thing is, World Animal Day was put in place to celebrate animals. Essentially because animals are critical and important to us. You know, they give us comfort. They are part of us companion animals. They also give us food in terms of farming animals. They also give us livelihoods, because what comes out of food animals is basically livelihoods. And if you look at other wild animals, like wild animals, they are also important for tourism, which then gives us aspects of livelihoods. And they also help us. If you look at donkeys, they help us to do our normal work. They ensure that they can carry certain things for us. And so essentially the World Animal Day is essentially to celebrate animals and to take a step back and understand and appreciate the animals, and especially to look critically at their welfare.
True.
Yeah.
In Kenya, most of the time, it's always said when it's Mother's Day, it's really loud and gifts are there. Yeah. And it's up to us to start looking at when such days are there, especially recognized worldwide, we look at the rights and welfare and what needs to be done on that, right?
Yeah, that's what we intend to do. We have actually been celebrating World Animal Days for a while. I think it's just the fact that COVID came, and then COVID regulations that has thrown us a bit off. But as a country, we have been celebrating World Animal Day for several number of years, driven by the Veterinary Association in conjunction with animal welfare organizations like World Animal Protection, which I work for.
Yeah. Karibu sana kwa studio, Daktari. I'm really privileged to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even when you're talking about conservation conversation,
yeah,
and the issue of looking at sustainability on how we use it in this world, because like you said, we have to celebrate when it's there and talk about it when it's important, right?
Yeah.
I felt like we need to look at the intensive farming activity, and just to understand what it is and its effects on us. So probably we start with what intensive farming is.
It's an interesting conversation, Cheru, and in fact, intensive farming is where we actually bring animals together closely and we try to manage them in a very highly high mechanized sort of system, where we, instead of, if you look at traditionally the way we used to keep cows were allowed to go to the field, they would graze, then in the evening maybe get some water and be supplemented. But essentially what has happened in terms of dairy systems is that we have then brought cows into sort of housing and enclosed them in certain small places, which then means we have to bring their food to them, and then we must manage them in terms of ensuring that they are comfortable in the environment they're in, that they have adequate food and water, and that they have all their needs, what we would call in animal welfare as freedoms, the 5 fundamental freedoms for animals. We must ensure that that's catered for. But that intensive farming then has certain things that then leads to what you're talking about, the subject today, about biodiversity. And I want to start with the easiest one. Because of intensification, which is being driven by urbanization, we are all getting into urban spaces. The spaces where we had for keeping animals is getting less and less. And so essentially what is then happening is that there's a rubbing between farming on one level and animals in one level. And especially if you look at biodiversity, where we then look at natural habitats for wildlife. So there's that conflict between wildlife and the natural habitats and farming. And then there's that challenge of then who takes predominance. And if you see in this country, in places like going to the coast, you find this big, or in Nairobi here where we had a national park, you're slowly finding that those spaces are no longer there. And so wildlife is having a challenge to survive in this urbanization where intensive farming is linked to it. But even more interesting is the fact that that intensive farming is also eating into those lands. So if you look at dairy cows, we need to provide them with feed. And when you look at feeds, a part of the feeds is grain, a part of it is soya, and so we need spaces to grow. And so what is happening globally is that in order to be able to feed these animals, we are encroaching on forests and clearing forests. A classical example is Amazon is being cleared to grow soya for the feed industry. And so what happens to the animals or the biodiversity in that setting? And that is where the challenge is coming around intensive farming system in this globalization setting up. And it's something that even in this country we're beginning to see. I think sometime last year there was a report about certain people buying lands, I think down in Savo, and then trying to grow avocado. And you see that's where now you can see farming is now getting into conflict with natural habitats, which then leads to loss of biodiversity at certain levels. And I think it is critical and important as a country to have that discussion and then make conclusions of where are we going to do farming, how are we going to manage our biodiversity and natural habitats and natural wildlife for that matter. Even in Nairobi, you can see what is happening at the national park. There's that conflict between wildlife and the corridors that have now been encroached to. So those are some of the things, discussions we're having around some of these topics.
True.
Yeah.
You mentioned the farm in Savo. I don't know if the case is still in court, but there's a time we were talking about that. When you're talking about the effect of intensive farming, and you mentioned clearly encroaching in those spaces, right? Yeah. This is not sustainable.
Exactly, it's not sustainable. And then the encroaching is also at two levels, or certain levels. The first level is when I'm talking about plants being used to growing plants to feed animals, which then encroaches. But beyond that is also the impact of that farming itself on the environment. And as an organization, we are now at the beginning of a study where we want to see the impact of pig farming on the natural environment. The manure that comes from these farms, and especially when it's intensive farming and you have a lot of animals in one space, what happens to that manure? If it's then carelessly, for lack of a better word, distributed into the environment, does it have an impact? Does it have an impact on the environment itself? More so when you're looking at situations where intensive farming is also using things like chemicals, antibiotics, pesticides. This manure then has pesticides, chemicals, antibiotics, organisms that are resistant. If you then dispose it carelessly in the environment, are you then causing a spread of organisms that are resistant to certain dawas? Is that also then being seen if it rains around these farms? Is that then seeping into waterways? And I think certain studies have been done in this country where we've looked at what happens and what is chemicals are being found. And you find a lot of them, if you look at cases like places like in Naivasha, you find that a lot of those chemicals are actually linked to certain farming practices. And those are some of the impacts of intensive farming on the environment. And as you rightly pointed out, it's not only intensive farming from farm animals, but it's also intensive farming from the crop side of it, and how then is it impacting on the environment. Very interesting things that are coming out. I think it's something that we need to then look at. And so those are the kind of levels of intensifications that we're looking at. First, we're moving into spaces that used to be natural habitats, then the manure and the waste coming from these systems, what impact is it having on the environment? Yep.
I think this conversation, most of the time when we are having it with people on the ground, we tend to think it's affecting the land and the animals and ends there. But you said something very important, Dr. in terms of the organism and the chemicals that are there. And I'm thinking, me and people who are watching at home looking at it, you might be quick, if you're clever, you look at it affecting you as well and your health, right?
Exactly, and that's why we work around what is called One Health, because the world is beginning to realize that there's a connection between what happens at production level, at farming level, whether it's agriculture for crops or animals, and that's why there's a move to bring the crops or environment people with the animal people, the vets and production fellows, and humans, because whatever happens in this environment is the same environment you're staying in. Your house is in that environment. So if there's pollution or contamination from farming system, from animal farms, it ends up in the same environment. And those organisms that I'm talking about, or those pesticides or those chemicals that we're using, have the capacity to then end up on your food, which then has an impact on you as a consumer. And that is something that we are, as an organization, we look at critically. And then if the animal is mishandled for one reason or another, and remember I talked about 5 freedoms, maybe I should just explain which these 5 freedoms are. Yeah. It's, the first one is freedom from hunger and thirst, which is basically saying the animal must be fed, and be fed with food that meets its nutritional requirements, and also with water. Yeah, and sometimes you find that because of environmental contamination, the water that you're using as contaminants, which then ends up in the animal. The interesting thing about animals is that whatever you give them ends up on your plate. If you give them water that is contaminated with mycotoxins or feed with mycotoxins, that mycotoxins will be in milk, meat, or eggs in that case. If you end up with antibiotics because you're feeding them on antibiotics, or you're using antibiotics in the production system, that antibiotic will end up on your plate. And so that becomes very important, and that's why the One Health sort of thing is very critical. The second is about freedom from discomfort, which is about the environment we're keeping the animal. If it's a dairy cow, that field where it is, it has to have enough space for the animal to be able to walk, to be comfortable, but also to be protected from adverse weather conditions like heat and rain, etc. Yeah. And so in situations, if that is not done well, the animal ends up getting sick, which then means some of the diseases the animal picks, which will end up in the human population, and that's why, again, the One Health thinking is important. Last year, there was a research done to look at the impact of pandemics, whatever the diseases that have caused pandemics over the last, from 1940 to now. And it was found that around 50% of the diseases that have caused pandemics, swine flu, avian influenza, etc., are all from animal sources. And that's why it's becoming important to look at animals and manage animals properly, especially in the environment they're in. The third one is freedom from pain, injury, and disease, which essentially is saying it's easier to manage diseases at animal level. And I think as a country at certain levels we have failed, because we've laid emphasis on curative medicine, where when you get sick, Cheru, you go to a medical facility and a doctor treats you. We need to go back and look at it from a preventive aspect, where if the disease is coming from the animals, how do we manage it from the animals? Science tells us that about 70% of diseases, emerging and re-emerging diseases, are actually coming from animal systems. COVID is a good example. It came from a wet market where we were selling all manner of Yamo. And that's why we are looking at it from that One Health process. So maybe the country needs to look at animal health workers, the vets, the veterinary paraprofessionals, to ensure that they're also in the system, so that the prevention of disease at certain levels is managed at the animal level, and ensuring it doesn't spill into human populations. Then the fourth one is freedom to express national behavior, which is essentially saying the animal must have capacity to be an animal. If you can, and you're putting it in a chicken house, the chicken house must have enough bedding, must have enough patches for the animal to be able to patch, to scratch, and to be a chicken, because that then helps in the development of the animal and helps in ensuring that the meat that comes out of the animal is high quality meat that has no impact. And lastly is freedom from fear and distress, which is essentially to ensure that the animal does not go through any stressful situations. If you're transporting an animal and you tie it behind a motorbike, that's stressful. The meat quality of that animal deteriorates. That animal gets injured in that process, which then means the farmer doesn't make good money because they're losing products because of poor transportation. The animal is stressed, the quality of that meat is not good, or because of stress, the animal is not able to produce optimally, especially looking at dairy cows. If they're stressed, the milk production drops. And those are the things that we are talking about. So if you can cater in the animal systems and manage animals well, then the product that goes to humanity is good quality product that makes good quality, better money in terms of returns. The product is good quality, so the consumers are not having adverse effects. But if we mismanage that welfare at that level, as I've said, you end up with products that are not fit for human consumption at certain levels because they have antibiotics or they have organisms that are going to be detrimental to humanity, and that's why it's becoming very critical to manage the environment, humans, and animal health in a one health sort of process.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Dr. Very interesting. I'm seeing time is running out. We need to go for a short break.
Okay.
I'm sure my dad will give me 10 more minutes because I want us to look at the global trends. So I'm speaking to Dr. Victor Yamo from World Animal Protection here tonight to look at the effects of intensive farming. We'll be back shortly. Don't go so far.